Fritz Haber was a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, but he also had a dark side.
If there had been a Nuremberg trial after World War I, Haber would have probably been on trial and possibly been imprisoned.
He was the father of chemical weapons.
They had never seen anything like this before. No one knew what it was, so most of them ran for their lives.
Why did a man of science dedicate himself to war?
Science has these two sides, as it were, the immensely liberating and productive side, and then, unfortunately, the same brilliance applying itself to death.
The life and legacy of Fritz Haber. Just one story that happened this week in history. Welcome to This Week in History. I'm Josh Binswanger. For the next hour, we'll look back at the people, places, and events that made history during the week of January 28th to February 3rd. We begin in 1934 with the death of a Nobel Prize-winning chemist named Fritz Haber. He led a life that was characterized by contradiction and irony. And though his name is not well known today, his legacy is. Fritz Haber was the father of chemical weapons. April 1915, Ypres, Belgium. A green and gaseous cloud floats across the Western Front. It is poison gas, and it ushers in the terror of chemical weapons still being felt today. This is the story of Fritz Haber, who unleashed one of the cruelest weapons in history.
If Germany's fate was at stake in a war, he would do everything he could to make sure that Germany would win that war. The end justified the means for Haber.
Germany, 1904. Fritz Haber is a struggling scientist who has renounced his Judaism to advance his career. He sets his sights on a global crisis. There is growing concern that the world is running out of natural fertilizers. For the last 125 years, many have tried and failed to synthesize ammonia, the main ingredient of fertilizer. But that does not stop Haber. Haber's godson, Fritz Stern.
I remember him as a formidable, austere figure that one didn't take lightly. He had a tremendous intellectual hunger and the highest kind of scientific intelligence.
In 1909, Haber creates a chamber with a temperature of over 400 degrees and a pressure 200 times greater than sea level. The most extreme conditions ever created in a laboratory. The chamber forces nitrogen and hydrogen together to form the long sought-after ammonia. Even today, Haber's process is considered one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century. He is placed on a par with his good friend Albert Einstein, and he receives international acclaim.
Potentially, at the time, they saw it as the salvation of the world. And indeed, you could argue that since then, that discovery has fed millions of people.
5 years later, in 1914, World War I erupts. A machine gun capable of firing 100 rounds a minute is the weapon of choice, making the infantry charge that marked earlier wars futile. Both sides dig thousands of miles of trenches and lob grenades and artillery at each other. Hundreds of thousands die, but neither side advances more than a few miles. A fervent German patriot, Fritz Haber wants to end the carnage and win the war. On his own initiative, and in violation of international law, he begins to develop a chemical weapon.
He thought the injuries through artillery shells, the maiming of people and so on, was no better, so to speak, than what he, I think, assumed would be a non-lethal, different weapon to bring this to an end.
But many stand in strong opposition to his work on poison gas. His chief opponent is another chemist, Clara Haber, his own wife.
She was extremely depressed because as a chemist and I think an idealistic scientist, she had hoped that Haber's work would really be for the benefit of humanity. So she really saw nothing but evil coming out of this.
With constant family conflict and his marriage deteriorating, Haber presses on. He chooses chlorine gas, a toxic chemical used in the dye business, and adapts large commercial gas canisters to disperse the poison. On April 22, 1915, Haber is ready. Along the trenches of Ypres, Belgium, he supervises the release of over 5,700 canisters of chlorine gas. Having waited 3 weeks for the right wind conditions, the greenish vapor blows across no man's land. Heavier than air, the chlorine gas sinks into the Allied trenches.
They had never seen anything like this before. No one knew what it was, so obviously many of them ran. Most of them ran for their lives, and this is literally what they had to do to get away from it.
The chlorine gas causes the soldiers to choke and cough violently. Their lungs begin to fill with fluid as the acrid gas strips away their mucus lining. 5,000 Allied soldiers die, and 10,000 are wounded.
It cleared a large segment of the lines, and the Germans had open trenches that they could just walk through, and they did, and were able to capture a large portion of the line.
The man whose peacetime work fed millions had now killed and wounded thousands. For his effort, the Germans award Haber with a promotion to the rank of general. He throws a dinner party to celebrate his promotion, but his wife Clara is in no mood.
She argued with him, he took sleeping pills, went to bed, and she took his service revolver that night, went out in the back garden, and shot herself. My feeling is that she felt Haber had betrayed his science and betrayed her.
Haber doesn't let the personal tragedy affect his work. He departs for the Russian front to launch his second gas attack, leaving his wife's funeral arrangements to others. Haber's invention does not bring a quick end to the war. Instead, it unleashes an ever-escalating chemical arms race. Within 2 months of the first attack, the Allies compensate with 2.5 million primitive gas masks. Within 6 months, British labs have produced enough of their own chlorine gas to launch a counter-chemical attack. Within 9 months, Haber responds with a new chemical weapon, phosgene, 18 times more powerful than chlorine. Eventually, Haber's lab will unleash the most horrific chemical weapon, mustard gas.
It was very insidious because when you were first exposed to it, you didn't think anything was happening. But then, after some hours, blisters would start to form on whatever had been exposed. So if it was your skin, you would get blistered. If it was your eyes, you would be blinded. If it was your lungs, they would swell up and you would find it very hard to breathe.
Within a year of Haber's initial experimental attack, poison gas is an integral part of the arsenals on both sides. Eventually, an estimated 1/3 of all shells contain chemical weapons. By the time Germany surrenders in 1918, chemical warfare is responsible for 100,000 deaths. And the Allies want Fritz Haber extradited for war crimes.
If there had been a Nuremberg trial after World War I, which there was not, Haber would have probably been on trial and possibly been imprisoned for what he had done in the war.
But no one is ever tried for chemical warfare. Instead, just 6 months after the war ends, the man who had unleashed poison gas is awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for his peaceful pre-war work that fed millions. Many condemn the choice and refuse to shake the hand of a scientist who created such evil.
Science has these two sides, as it were, of which he was an extreme example. The immensely liberating and productive side, and then unfortunately the same brilliance applying itself to death.
After the war, Haber continues work with poison gas, but this time as Germany's National Commissioner for Pest Control. One of the poisons he helped develop is called Zyklon B. In 1933, with the rise of the Nazi Party, Haber, despite having renounced his Judaism, is forced to flee the country. He dies heartbroken in exile in Switzerland on January 29th, 1934. Fritz Haber never lives to see Zyklon B used on scores of his own people in the gas chambers of Nazi concentration camps.
The unbelievable ghastliness of it is, it was used in Auschwitz and in the camps. The fact that there is a kind of lineage that goes back to Haber, it is a kind of unfathomable tragedy.
Ironically, chlorine, which was used in World War I as a chemical weapon, was used recently to clean up traces of a biological weapon. When anthrax spores were found in the office of Senator Tom Daschle, a chlorine solution was used to disinfect it. Here is our weekly website poll. Tell us what you think.